Well, we talked about the cardiovascular system, but we're missing one important thing. So we can pump all this blood throughout our body. That's all good and all. We can increase blood flow when we start exercising, but what? How do we get oxygen in the blood? We know the blood goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, all that stuff, but how the hell do we get the oxygen in the blood? What controls the oxygen? What do we all need to know about oxygen in the respiratory system? It's a very good question, because you can have a heart, you can have blood, if we don't have oxygen, that's not really beneficial. So we're going to cover respiratory and hopefully in one whole video. Hopefully we're going to shoot for 10 minutes, shouldn't take that long. But essentially, when it comes to oxygen or any air molecule, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, argon, carbon monoxide, whatever you hell you want to talk about. First thing you talk about and what they always mention is something called partial pressure. Now, partial pressure it's really not a hard topic to understand, but every single professor and every single book I've read always try to complicate it and make it seem harder than it really is. And really, that's the basis of school, it seems, where they make everything 100,000 times harder than it really fucking is. So we'll just really simply break down partial pressure in one sentence. Partial pressure is the pressure that molecule has. Very simple. One sentence. So what that means is take oxygen. What is the pressure of oxygen in that container? Let's say it is 50 milligrams of mercury, which is a unit of pressure. Okay. Now, let's say there's oxygen and nitrogen in the same room. What is the partial pressure of oxygen? 50 milligrams of mercury. Just because nitrogen is in the same area that oxygen is doesn't mean it changes the pressure of oxygen. Oxygen doesn't give a fuck what is in the same enclosed area. It's still the same exact pressure. That is called partial pressure. It's the pressure of a molecule regardless of whatever the hell is in the same thing. The pressure of that molecule does not change. Now, how this relates to what we breathe, the partial pressure of oxygen in air. Now, we know air is 79% nitrogen, or if we don't, we know now. Air is 79% nitrogen, and it is 21% oxygen. So, anywhere on Earth, of course, in altitude, with regarding altitude, anywhere on Earth at the same altitude and sea level is 21. Actually, anywhere on Earth, any oxygen on the planet Earth, any air is 21 degrees fucking oxygen. Doesn't matter where you are, it's not going to change the percentage of oxygen in the air. Now, the partial pressure of oxygen can change, but the percentage does not change anywhere in the air. What I mean is, the formula for partial pressure is the percentage of that molecule, just the percent in the air, multiplied by the barometric pressure. And the barometric pressure is just the barometric pressure is really I don't really know a definition for it. I just know what it is. But barometric pressure is really some number, I guess, they pick for the pressure of air or whatever. But it's always 760 milligrams of mercury, regardless of where the hell you are on Earth. If you're under the sea, if you're in the air, on the stratosphere, whatever, it's always 760 milligrams of mercury. Now, to get the partial pressure of any molecule, you take 760 milligrams of mercury. Oh, sorry, confused. Barometric pressure is the pressure in sea level. Barometric pressure is sea level pressure. It's 760 milligrams of mercury. When you rise in altitude, barometric pressure decreases because really the pressure is decreased in a higher altitude. So the percent doesn't change, the percent is constant of the same molecule, but the barometric pressure decreases. So the barometric pressure of oxygen is 160 milligrams of mercury. Well, that's the partial pressure of oxygen. It's 160 milligrams of mercury in sea level. This is the sea level partial pressure of oxygen. It's 160 milligrams of mercury. And how you get this is 0.21, so percent in decimal form, times 760 milligrams of mercury. That's 160 milligrams of mercury. That's the partial pressure. 760 is sea level pressure, sea level barometric pressure. Now, say you're in altitude, this will decrease. This is still the same because you're still in Earth, so there's still 21% oxygen. So it'd be 0.21. Now, say you're on Mount Everest. That's probably like 300 milligrams of mercury. I don't know, barometric pressure. So the partial pressure of oxygen will be much lower because that formula. Okay, so now what this means, why we care about this, everything in the respiratory system has to deal with pressure. Pressure changes, diffusion, really anything in the body does by diffusion and pressure and differences. Pressure changes. Just like in the body, pressure decreases throughout this cardiovascular system, pressure moves in the body that way. So I'll bring up this really confusing graph, which I'll explain. This 160, and this is called the atmospheric pressure, which we just went over. It's the pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. So you inhale this oxygen, it's 160 milligrams of mercury. That's the pressure of the oxygen in whatever you inhale. This means the partial pressure in the alveoli. It's part of the lungs. You don't have to know lung anatomy, but it's part of the lungs. When it gets through the lungs, it gets moisture, water combines with it, everything goes through the throat, and its pressure decreases to about 105. See, it decreases because it's going through the alveoli sacs and the lungs anatomy. It's getting moisturized, all that good stuff. We don't really care about this. Now, this means the partial pressure in the arteries. That's what we care about. When the oxygen enters the arteries, it decreases to around 100. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries is around 100. I don't have another graph to show you, but what this is remember how the heart pumps blood to the pulmonary. It's deoxygenated. It picks up oxygen, goes back into the heart. Well, this is when it happens. It picks up the oxygen and it pumps it out in the aorta. And when it goes throughout the aorta and through the arteries, the partial pressure is 100. So the arterial partial pressure is 100. 100 milligrams of mercury in the arteries. I don't have a picture for this, but it's 100 milligrams of mercury in the arteries. You can forget about this. Don't worry about that. And then when it unloads in the capillaries, and then that's when the oxygen decreases in the capillaries and goes throughout the body. Diffusion, we already went over this. And in the veins, it's around 40. That's another important number. The partial pressure of oxygen in the veins is around 40. It's a lower pressure because most of the oxygen went into the body and the capillaries diffused out. And thus, then it decreases. And CO2 kind of does the opposite. CO2 partial pressure increases in the veins because that's how it works. You breathe out the CO2. That's really all you need to know is partial pressure decreases throughout the body. Because it's 160, it has no problem decreasing in the alveoli and thus going into the arteries. Now, say you're in altitude, which we'll talk about more when we get to the Bohr effect, but say you're in altitude, this isn't 160 anymore, this is like 120 probably. The difference it has to decrease isn't that great. That's why it's so much harder to breathe in altitude. It's hard. So that's the graph again. Very simple graph if you think about it. Atmospheric pressure decreases by combines with water in the alveoli, the lungs. When it gets to the arteries, P8 little AO2. This is usually very confusing, but P little AO2 is just a partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries. It's around 100. Then when it's in the veins, it's around 40. PVO2. Forget PCO2. This is a graph from the graduate exercise physiology, but it's very beneficial. If they showed you this graph in undergrad exercise physiology, it would have made much better sense. But of course, that's not how school works. They try to make everything as confusing as possible. Now let's get to something called the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect, what this graph is showing, it's just showing you got partial pressure on the bottom, percent saturation, and this is the same thing, percent saturation. Now oxygen or blood is loaded with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin holds oxygen. Hemoglobin is this little guy. When he holds oxygen, he's happy. He has a bunch of oxygen. And the percent saturation is how much saturated he is with oxygen. Obviously, a higher saturation is good. You're carrying more oxygen with the hemoglobin. If say you're 50% saturated, well, he's not that happy because he's only 50% full of oxygen. You want happy hemoglobin, not sad hemoglobin. So, what this graph is showing is that it's a sigmoidal curve, which means it's sigmoidal, and at partial pressure of 100, well, that's what it is in the arteries, partial pressure of 100, you are 100% saturated. 100%. Mr. Hemoglobin is very happy because you're very saturated. Now, when it goes through the veins and unloads, that's this, you are still 80% saturated. What gives? You've only unloaded 20% of your saturation on the oxygen. So he's still happy because he still has 20% oxygen. But that's not good because this is when in the veins. This kind of coincides with the microcirculation of blood or the AV difference, where you only take a percent of it, you can take a lot more. Well, this kind of lines with it, and this kind of shows what oxygen is doing. You only went from 80%, 100% saturation when it circulated in the arteries to 80% saturation in the veins. Well, you're still 80% saturated. Why are you so saturated with oxygen? This is when you're at rest. Like this is when the AV difference is small. Why is it so small? And it's because it's sigmoidal, pretty much. But I don't have a picture of the graph moving, but when you start exercising, this graph shifts to the right. And what that means is it kind of does this. Shifts to the right. And this means at the lungs it's still 100% saturated. That's not going to change. It's still 100% saturated at the lungs. But now in the veins, instead of being 40 milligrams of mercury, it's still 40 milligrams of mercury in the veins. But instead of being 80% saturated, now it's, of course I drew this very exaggerated, you will probably still be 40% saturated, not 20% saturated. But now you're less saturated at the same partial pressure in the veins. That's called the Bohr effect. That's what happens, say, when the AV difference goes from 5 to 15, going back way back then in the videos. But why? Now the reason why the Bohr effect shifted, why it shifted to the right, is because the word they always use is it facilitates oxygen unloading. Just a fancy way to say you use more oxygen at the same partial pressure, or you're more efficient at taking oxygen. Fancy word of saying something very simple. They like to do that. And what causes this Bohr effect? We'll go a little pretty. This is a more realistic Bohr effect, where it's like 40, not 20. It's more realistic. You take more oxygen while you're exercising. Why does it shift? Well, things that cause this shift are, ironically, just the same exact things that cause the microcirculation of blood flow in the capillaries to relax. Pretty much byproducts of exercise. Lactic acid, or a high ion concentration, a high CO2 partial pressure, which means you have a lot of CO2 in your blood, or heat. Oh, well, it's very similar to the exact things that cause the microcirculation of blood. Byproducts of exercise. A high hydrogen ion concentration. And what is a high okay, so now this is referred to in two ways. It can be called a high hydrogen ion concentration, which means you have a lot of hydrogen ions or a lot of lactic acid in your blood. That's a byproduct of exercise. But this also causes your pH to decrease. Same exact way, that's more chemistry, but a low pH is the same thing as a high hydrogen ion concentration. So that causes it to shift to the right. PCO2, a high PCO2 concentration causes the shift to the right. All that means is you have a lot of CO2 in your blood. If you have a lot of CO2 in your blood, that means you're exhaling a lot faster than you're inhaling. And in the next section, or in this video, we'll also talk about that. Heat is also a byproduct of exercise. It causes the curve to shift to the right. Now the curve can also shift to the left. If it shifts to the left, that means that doesn't happen when you exercise. The only time that happens is for myoglobin in infants, in fetuses, in infants. That's not really important when it comes to exercise, but in case he doesn't mention it, it never really shifts to the left. So if any answers or any questions talk about the Bohr effect shifting to the left, that is wrong. It does not shift to the left, it always shifts to the right. Because of hydrogen ions, high PCO2, or heat. Byproducts of exercise. That is very important. They love asking that. Now the very, very last thing we'll talk about is ventilation, or how he says on his thing, the oxygen cost of exercise. What this means is, this is a formula that measures how much oxygen, essentially your oxygen liters you have per breath. That means batteries dying, so it'll speed up really fast. Ventilation is how much oxygen you're breathing in. Tidal volume is how much air you're inhaling. Frequency is how fast you're breathing. What does this look like? Oh, well, this looks just like cardiac output. That's because it is. It's the same exact thing as, well, it's not the same thing. It's oxygen, but it's the same. Shit, what am I thinking? It's the same theory as CO2. I don't need to explain it all, but tidal volume, or how much air you inhale, it's the same. Oh wait, tidal volume looks just like stroke volume. It increases to 50% of VO2 and stagnates. Frequency looks just like heart rate. It increases exponentially past 50%. This is the same thing as cardiac output. Okay, well, that's essentially it. That's the oxygen cost of breathing. Just like now just change this to say oxygen cost, cardiac output cost of exercise. And that seems confusing, but it's the same thing. Breathing causes your ventilation, your tidal volume, how much liters per breath to increase, and that looks just like cardiac output. It's the same thing. Exercise causes your tidal volume to increase up to 50% of your VO2, just like it does with stroke volume. Exercise causes your frequency to increase exponentially past 50% of VO2 or past submaximal, just like heart rate. It's the same exact fucking thing. This looks just, well, that looks just like the Finkelstein mechanism. Don't worry about this graph, actually. This isn't graduate X-Phys, it's more advanced. No one cares about that. Okay, so now, same thing as the heart. Oxygen cost, ventilation, same thing as the heart. Same thing as cardiac output. Graph explains it very simple. Bohr effect. Good. Breathing. Done. Respiratory. Done.